Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're going to be covering off a spring maintenance item, certainly a recommended maintenance item for most of these older bikes, and that's a brake fluid replacement, as well as bleeding, obviously. And we're looking at our 82 Goldwing Interstate. This is actually my daily rider. It's a good bike, otherwise it's in great shape. Front brakes do feel soft. Not sure if it's because it's not exactly a performance model or if maybe there's some air bubbles in the system. Anyway, I know just from looking at the reservoir there, the fluid in there is pretty crusty. I'm not sure when the last time it's been changed. So let's get started. Now, before we start, we're going to make sure that we have some fresh brake fluid, obviously. This particular machine takes .3, as well as the factory torque specs. Got these from the factory service manual here, and you want to note that these bolts don't take a lot of torque. Most of them take less than 10 foot-pounds, and even the larger caliper pivot bolts take 20 pounds or so. Go reefing on these, and I can guarantee they'll snap like twigs. That said, it's not a difficult job, and we'll be done in the time it would take to drive it down the hill to the Honda dealership. So our first step, we're going to head on over to the master cylinder, give it a quick visual inspection, just make sure there's no obvious failures here. While we're at it, we may as well check the steel and rubber lines. I've done this off camera, as well as the front calipers. Check for leaks as well as worn or damaged components, just good practice. Check the pads and measure the rotor thickness, since it'll be convenient to replace them at this time before we start working on the hydraulic system. So we'll loosen the master cylinder reservoir cap and remove the diaphragm carefully to avoid drips. Also, the other thing to note, brake fluid kills clear coat systems. It'll eat right through like warm water through a sugar cube. Now in cars it's no big deal because generally the master cylinder and the calipers are kept well away from the paint. But in motorbikes, the brake fluid reservoir is right on top of the handlebars, in a perfect position to splash brake fluid all over your nice paint all over your tank and fairing. Now we'll be using a vacuum pump. Not everyone has one, but in my opinion, everyone should. Just makes this job a heck of a lot quicker. You don't need to go nag your wife or your kids come pump the brake lever for you while you got your bleeding operations going on. And they come in handy for a ton of other mechanical automotive tasks. Paid about $50 for this one, and it's been well worth it so far. Generally, you don't want to leave this open any longer than you have to. So if you're going to be leaving the job incomplete, make sure to put the cap and the diaphragm back on just to avoid getting dust in the system. And afterwards, we'll add fresh brake fluid to the max line. Now, in linked systems, i.e. fancy brakes, you'll have a particular order that the lines will need to be bled off in. Not the case on this bike, so we'll just start on the front left. We got more room on this side anyway. So what we'll do is we'll put a little bit of a vacuum on the line and open the bleeder screw until the fluid flows out in a stable manner. And while you're doing this, just watch the reservoir on top of the handlebars to make sure it doesn't go empty, or else you'll just be sucking air into the system. Now, at the same time, watch the bubbles around the vacuum hose. And when you see them change from big bubbles to a whole bunch of tiny bubbles, you'll know that you're done with this fitting. Tighten the bleeder screw. Again, I just put a little bit more vacuum on this to make sure that fluid doesn't go everywhere. And then carefully break the vacuum line off the nipple there. Now, once we're done with this caliper, we can move on to the other side, as well as any other calipers on the system. And now, once the system is bled, you want to go up and check the level of final time and add more brake fluid, obviously, if required. Then you can go ahead and reinstall the diaphragm and the reservoir cap. Once everything's tight, you want to make sure to pump the brake lever a few times to ensure that it's firm. And this is also a really good time to check for leaks. I know some of these nipples sometimes want to seep a little bit. Resist the temptation to over-reef on these things because they're basically made out of warm cheese and they'll fall apart pretty quick. And yeah, with a firm brake lever, roll it back and forth with your feet a couple times, or at least I like to do this, just to make sure that you've got good firm brake feel on it. And do make a note to yourself to take this for a road test. Don't just hop right on it and start doing some high-speed riding, make sure to give it a good low-speed brake test in town. Just make sure that everything's working correctly. But in the meantime, this is job done. Thanks for watching. Now, one other thing, I will say that in my experience, the front right bleeder screw tends to stick worse than the left, especially if the bike's been parked outdoors. I don't have any footage on sheared bleeder screw removal, but if it happens to you, I'll provide the following advice. It's going to feel frustrating. Just make sure to take a breath. If you feel yourself getting tilted, put down your tools and come back another couple hours or even another day. Frustration leads to bad decisions. The other thing, drain the system, remove the caliper, and get it to the vise. You try and work next to the wheel, you're just going to cause more damage, and the extra access is going to be a huge advantage going forward with the removal. Now, if you look at the bleeder screw itself, the cone-shaped seat at the bottom of the screw is responsible for sealing the system, i.e. the threads are only there to keep the bleeder screw in place and not the fluid itself. This does mean that we get a bit of extra leeway, and as long as the screw is intact, that seat will provide some defense against metal chips and other debris entering the system. And I will say those Canadian Tire screw extractors are surprisingly effective on small fasteners like these. Use the reamer head on a drill, or if you have a die grinder, you can gouge it out to seat the extractor. Set it by hand with a driver, and just finesse it with an impact gun on the lowest setting. It might take a few tries, but I've had consistent success with this method. And this works great for anything up to a 12 mil or a 1/2 inch bolt. Those little extractor things are pretty solid in my opinion. And I will say that drilling these things is possible, and in a lot of cases it's a good option. The fluid passage running down the center of these screws will act like a natural pilot hole. That said, if the situation has escalated to this point and you're anything but a Red Seal journeyman, I'd just bag it up and bring it down to the local mechanic and kiss some ass. They have all the tools, they know all the tricks, and we'll say from experience that many possess a merciful heart. Just make sure to do this before you've destroyed the caliper completely, or they're just going to laugh at you and send you off to the parts counter. Now, I do want to address something. I do see some fellow YouTubers taking torches to these or welding nuts on or other exotic things like that. That's great if you're looking at a rusted up 3/4 inch bolt or an M16 bolt on a frame end or lower control arm. But really, these bleeder screws are weak and they're hollow, and they're 6 mils diameter. So mechanical extraction is going to be way faster and less risky with a cleaner result. If you think firing up the acetylene torch should be the first step to extract a hollow cheese-grade M5 coarse thread screw in an aluminum-bodied caliper surrounded by rubber hoses, you're probably doing it wrong. There, I said it.